Good business requires discipline, not indulgence, my boss said, sliding the receipt across the table like evidence. I stood there, calm on the outside, while he fired me for spending money he had approved, money that closed the biggest deal of my career. Security was already on the way. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just nodded and walked out, knowing something he didn't. What happened next didn't start with revenge. It started with one quiet phone call and a truth they couldn't take back. If you've ever been punished for doing your job right, share your story in the comments and subscribe. Some lessons only come after the door slams shut. For years, I was the person people trusted when the stakes were high, not because I talked the loudest, but because I listened longer than everyone else. I built my career quietly, one relationship at a time, in an industry where most people chased numbers and forgot the humans attached to them. I wasn't flashy. I didn't dominate meetings or interrupt executives to prove I belonged. I prepared. I documented. I followed through. By the time this story begins, I'd spent nearly a decade proving my value in ways that never made headlines, but always showed up on the revenue reports. Clients asked for me by name. Colleagues came to me when deals stalled. I was the one sent in when trust needed repairing, when egos needed managing, when a contract required more than just a signature. My role wasn't officially glamorous, but internally, everyone knew the truth. If a partnership mattered, I was involved. I understood how decisions were really made, especially at the enterprise level, where money followed confidence and confidence followed consistency. I also understood my company's weaknesses. Leadership loved slogans about discipline and efficiency, but they had a habit of confusing control with competence. They celebrated frugality in internal emails while quietly depending on people like me to smooth over the damage that mindset caused with clients. I learned early that survival meant protecting myself as carefully as I protected the business. Every approval was saved, every guideline was highlighted, every conversation that hinted at future conflict was summarized and archived, not out of paranoia, but experience. I'd watched too many capable people get blamed for outcomes they were never empowered to influence. I refused to be one of them. My performance reviews were consistent, reliable, strategic, trusted, never dramatic, never troublesome. I thought that would be enough. Outside the office, my life was simple and structured. I had responsibilities that didn't allow for impulsive risk. Stability mattered to me in a way it hadn't when I was younger. I didn't gamble with my reputation or my job because too many people depended on me getting it right. That responsibility sharpened my instincts. It made me patient, it made me careful, and it made me very good at reading rooms before anyone else sensed the temperature shift. I knew when leadership meetings went quiet for the wrong reasons. I knew when a cost-cutting memo meant someone was about to become an example. I also knew when my work was being quietly resented, especially by people who measured success in spreadsheets instead of outcomes. Still, I believed competence would protect me, that if I stayed professional, if I stayed within policy, if I delivered results no one could dispute, I would be safe. That belief wasn't naive. It was earned, until it wasn't. What most people didn't see was how often I absorbed friction so others could stay comfortable. How many late nights I spent preparing materials so executives could feel confident in rooms they barely understood. How many client frustrations I redirected before they ever reached leadership. I wasn't invisible. I was underestimated. There's a difference, and underestimation has a way of becoming dangerous when combined with authority. The morning everything changed, I walked into the office the same way I always did. Prepared, calm, unaware that I was about to learn how quickly years of quiet contribution could be reduced to a single line item on a piece of paper. The deal didn't fall into my lap, and it wasn't luck. It started months earlier with a conversation most people would have dismissed as casual, the kind that happens at industry events where everyone pretends to listen while waiting to talk. I paid attention instead. I asked questions others didn't bother with. I followed up when no one else did. That was how the relationship began, long before numbers entered the picture. When it became clear the opportunity was real, I treated it the way I always had, methodically, patiently, and within the boundaries I knew leadership claimed to value. This wasn't a small account. It was the kind of partnership executives love to reference in town halls, but rarely understood in practice. Long timelines, multiple stakeholders, a client who cared less about buzzwords and more about whether the people across the table actually respected his time and his business. From the beginning, it was clear he did. He asked direct questions. He noticed preparation. He remembered details from earlier conversations. That kind of client doesn't respond to shortcuts. He responds to consistency. As the discussions moved forward, meetings shifted from conference calls to in-person sessions, then to longer working conversations that stretched beyond rigid agendas. Decisions were made in moments that couldn't be scheduled, over explanations that required patience, not pressure. Every step forward was earned. I followed policy exactly as written. I confirmed approvals. I stayed well within the discretionary limits spelled out in my contract. Every expense had a purpose tied directly to progress. Nothing extravagant, nothing impulsive, just enough to signal that the partnership mattered. Internally, the response was mixed. Senior leadership wanted updates, but not details. They liked the projected revenue, but bristled at the process required to secure it. Questions started coming framed as concern. Did this really need to happen in person? Was this level of engagement necessary? Couldn't this be handled more efficiently? Efficiency was their favorite word, especially when it wasn't their relationship on the line. I answered carefully, aware that every explanation was being measured not against outcome, but against discomfort. I could feel the resistance building, subtle at first, then sharper. There were pauses after my updates that lingered too long. Emails that used to get quick approvals came back with added scrutiny. No one said no outright, but the tone shifted. It was the kind of shift you only recognize if you've lived inside organizations long enough to know that success can make the wrong people nervous. Still, I kept going. The client kept engaging, the numbers firmed up. Legal started reviewing drafts. Implementation timelines were discussed seriously for the first time. By the time the agreement was ready to be finalized, everyone wanted credit. Executives asked how soon they could announce it. Forecasts were adjusted. Internal celebrations were quietly planned. And yet, even as the deal moved toward completion, I sensed something wasn't right. The same leaders eager to claim the win were uncomfortable with how it had been achieved. The care, the time, the human investment required didn't fit neatly into their worldview. I understood then that the deal itself wasn't the only thing being evaluated. So was I. Not on results, but on whether the way I worked aligned with how power wanted to see itself reflected. When the contract closed, I felt relief, not triumph. I knew what it represented. I also knew, instinctively, that it had set the stage for a reckoning no spreadsheet could predict. The meeting was scheduled with no context, just a calendar block labeled expense review, which immediately told me it wasn't really about expenses at all. When I walked into the conference room, the air felt wrong, heavier than usual, like something had already been decided before I arrived. The blinds were half closed even though it was still early, and the overhead lights cast that flat, unforgiving glow that makes every room feel like an interrogation space. He was already there, sitting at the head of the table with a stack of papers squared neatly in front of him, jaw tight, fingers tapping once, twice, then stopping. HR sat to his right, not looking at me, her folder unopened like a prop waiting for its cue. I took my seat without speaking. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't reference the contract that had closed days earlier. Instead, he slid the papers toward me with 2 fingers, as if they were contaminated. Receipts, clipped together, dates circled, totals underlined in red. He didn't raise his voice at first. That came later. He started with disappointment, the kind that sounds rehearsed, as if he'd practiced it in front of a mirror. He talked about standards, about optics, about discipline. He said the amount like it was obscene, repeating it slowly, pausing after each digit, waiting for me to flinch. I didn't. I explained calmly, referencing policy, approvals, the purpose behind each line. I spoke the way I always had, measured and factual, because I still believed logic mattered in rooms like this. That belief lasted about 30 seconds. His face changed when he realized I wasn't apologizing. The disappointment hardened into something sharper, more personal. He leaned forward and said the words I'd heard him use before with others, the ones that meant there would be no discussion. Wasteful, careless, a poor example. He said it didn't matter what the outcome was, that principles mattered more than results. When I reminded him that the spending fell well within my authorized limits, he waved it away as if contracts were suggestions and authority flowed in only one direction. The moment that stuck with me wasn't the accusation. It was the certainty. He had already decided that I was the problem, and the receipts were just a convenient excuse. HR finally opened her folder then, the sound of paper shifting louder than it should have been in the silence. She slid a document across the table, careful to keep her hands neutral, her expression blank. Severance terms, 2 weeks, effective immediately. I remember noticing how clean the pages looked, how prepared they were, how little room there was for surprise. He said the words termination and misuse in the same sentence, and something settled in my chest. Not panic, but clarity. I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a demonstration. He wanted to show control, to remind everyone what happened when process was questioned, even by someone who delivered results. Security was mentioned casually, as if it were a formality, not a humiliation. I stood up slowly, smoothing my jacket, nodding once. I didn't ask for reconsideration. I didn't bring up the deal again. I could see in his eyes that it wouldn't have mattered. HR avoided my gaze as I signed where the tabs indicated, her pen hovering like she was afraid it might burn her. When I placed my badge on the table, next to the receipts that had suddenly become evidence, he looked satisfied, like a lesson had been successfully taught. What he didn't see was that the lesson wasn't for me. It was for everyone else watching from behind glass walls and half-open doors, learning exactly how fragile loyalty became when power felt challenged. As I walked out of that room, escorted by someone who wouldn't meet my eyes, I understood that whatever had just ended for me had already begun unraveling for them, even if they didn't know it yet. The walk from that conference room to my desk felt longer than it ever had, every step echoing too loudly against the polished floor, every glance from coworkers landing and then darting away as if silence itself were contagious. No one said anything. They didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. I was no longer part of the system, and the system didn't like reminders of what it discarded. Security stayed a respectful distance behind me, close enough to be seen, far enough to pretend this wasn't about punishment. I packed methodically, the way I approached everything else. I placed my notebook in my bag, the one filled with timelines and handwritten reminders only I could decode. I wrapped a framed photo carefully, avoiding the glass. I unplugged my charger. Small actions, deliberate, grounding. I refused to rush. If this was my exit, it would happen on my terms. The air in the office felt thinner the longer I stood there, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something dramatic that never came. That disappointed them, I think. Drama would have made this easier to dismiss. Calm made it harder. By the time I reached the parking structure, the heat had settled in, thick and unmoving, pressing down from all sides. I sat in my car with the door closed and the engine off for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the quiet settle. There was no urge to cry, no shaking panic, just a steady awareness that a line had been crossed and couldn't be uncrossed. I turned the key, pulled out, and merged into traffic like it was any other afternoon. At the first long red light, I picked up my phone. I didn't scroll. I didn't hesitate. I made one call. It wasn't an act of defiance or revenge. It was professional courtesy, the kind I'd practiced my entire career. When he answered, his voice was warm, already moving forward, already planning next steps. I told him simply that I was no longer with the firm and that someone else would likely reach out to transition the work. I didn't editorialize. I didn't complain. I stated a fact. The silence on the other end stretched longer than I expected. When he spoke again, his tone had changed, sharpened by confusion and disbelief. He asked why. I told him the truth, without embellishment, without accusation. A pause followed, heavier than the first. I could hear movement, the subtle sounds of someone standing up, pacing, recalculating. He asked who made the decision. I answered. He said he needed a number. I gave it to him, that was all. I wished him well and ended the call before the light turned green. The rest of the drive passed in a blur of radio static and half-heard commentary, my phone lighting up repeatedly on the seat beside me. The name on the screen appeared again and again, first insistent, then urgent, then careful. Voicemails piled up, their tone shifting from anger to concern to something that sounded suspiciously like regret. I didn't listen, not yet. I already knew what they would say. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun was low and the day felt heavier than it should have, like the world was pausing before a storm. Inside the house, the quiet wrapped around me, unfamiliar and absolute. I set my bag down, poured a glass of water, and finally allowed myself to breathe. Whatever came next would come because of choices they made after I left, not because of anything I did. And that knowledge was steadier than anger, sharper than fear. The first message came less than 10 minutes after I walked through my front door, my phone vibrating against the kitchen counter while I stood there staring at nothing. I didn't pick it up. I already knew who it was. The second message followed almost immediately, then the third, each one more urgent than the last. By the time I poured myself a glass of water, the screen was lighting up non-stop, the same name repeating until it felt absurd. I let the calls go unanswered because whatever they needed from me now was something they should have considered before they escorted me out of the building. When I finally sat down and listened, the shift was unmistakable. Gone was the certainty, the righteousness, the confidence he displayed in that conference room. In its place was strain. He accused me of creating a problem, of saying something I shouldn't have, of overstepping. Then he corrected himself and asked me to call him back so we could clear up a misunderstanding. That word again, misunderstanding, as if a signed termination and a security escort were clerical errors, as if tone, intent, and choice didn't matter. The calls kept coming throughout the evening from different numbers now, voices layered with tension I hadn't heard before. Reception, an executive assistant, someone from legal whose name I barely recognized, each message more careful than the last, each one asking for the same thing, my help. I didn't respond. I spent that night thinking instead, not about what I'd lost, but about what I knew. I knew the client wasn't impulsive. He didn't react emotionally without reason. He valued preparation and honesty, and he despised being dismissed. I knew the contract structure because I'd been the one who'd explained it to leadership in the first place, the clauses they'd barely skimmed while nodding along. And I knew the person who'd fired me well enough to predict how he would handle pressure. Defensively, rigidly convinced that authority alone would carry him through. The next morning, my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. I answered. His voice was calm, but there was an edge underneath it, the sound of someone who had just seen something fall apart. He told me what happened after our call, how he'd reached out directly, expecting clarification, maybe even an apology on my behalf. Instead, he'd been lectured. He told me how the conversation shifted the moment he questioned the decision, how my former supervisor doubled down, reframing the entire deal as incidental, implying that any competent employee could replace me without consequence. As he spoke, I could picture the scene with unsettling clarity, the same posture, the same tone I'd seen used internally for years. Control through dismissal, authority through minimization. He paused and then said something that landed heavier than anything else. He said the decision to walk away had nothing to do with me being fired. It had everything to do with what that conversation revealed. Trust, once shaken, doesn't recover on command. He told me they'd already initiated termination notices, that the process was underway, that legal teams were involved. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was a deep, quiet confirmation that I hadn't imagined the rot I'd been navigating for years. While we spoke, another call came in, then another. I ignored them both. He asked what I planned to do next. I told him the truth. I hadn't decided. I needed time. He respected that. He always had. After we hung up, I sat in silence watching the phone light up again, the urgency now bordering on desperation. Messages grew more cautious, more deferential. Words like concerned and reconsider replaced accusations. The power dynamic had shifted, and they could feel it slipping through their fingers. I didn't return a single call that day, not out of spite, but clarity. They no longer had anything to offer me that I wanted. Whatever explanation they were preparing now was meant to undo damage that had already been done, not to correct a mistake. By the time evening came, the panic had fully arrived at my doorstep, loud and insistent, demanding attention it no longer deserved. And for the first time since that conference room, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth I'd been circling all along. The decision they thought would put me in my place had exposed them instead, and nothing I said or did from this point forward would be more powerful than the silence they'd earned. They asked for the meeting like it was a favor they were offering me, not a necessity they were scrambling toward. The message was polite, almost respectful, a sharp contrast to the certainty that had ended my employment days earlier. I agreed to come in midweek, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to see how power behaved when it realized it had miscalculated. Walking back into the building felt strange, familiar and distant at the same time, like revisiting a place that no longer belonged to me. This conference room was different from the first. Higher floor, better view, thicker carpet meant to signal importance. The CEO sat at the table when I arrived, posture composed, hands folded, the expression of someone trying to project control while quietly counting losses. The man who had fired me sat beside him, rigid, eyes forward, jaw tight. No HR this time, no security, just damage control. The CEO opened with appreciation, thanked me for routing structure so even a rookie could jump in without sinking the operation. But my real breakthrough came when I realized that every system in the building was speaking a different language. Nothing was integrated. Nothing communicated. Everything relied on human intervention to keep it alive. They didn't need another patch. They needed a single heartbeat guiding the entire operation. That was the moment I envisioned the core hardware module I later built through my own company, a streamlined processing unit designed not to think for the warehouse, but to coordinate it with perfect timing. I installed sensors that tracked movement down to fractions of a second, redesigned pallet flow to eliminate blind corners, and implemented routing so efficient trucks turned over in a third of the time. Within 6 months, Skybridge went from a liability to one of the Southwest's fastest turnaround hubs. Mason strutted through the floor like he'd been the mastermind behind it. Executives brought investors to tour our innovation, and the workers? For the first time in years, they weren't drowning. Overtime dropped, injury rates plummeted, productivity skyrocketed, and me? I kept my head down, working, improving, refining, making sure every piece operated flawlessly. I didn't complain when Mason erased my name from presentations. I didn't argue when Leo, the CFO, hinted that consultants like me should feel grateful for any visibility at all. I swallowed it. All of it, because deep down, I believed good work would eventually speak for itself. What I didn't realize then was that some people will bulldoze right over you to take credit for the foundation you poured with your own hands. But I also didn't realize something else. While they were busy celebrating themselves, I was building something they could never control. When Skybridge hired me, they didn't just need a systems overhaul, they needed a lifeline. The board was panicking quietly behind closed doors, praying no one would notice how close they were to losing their biggest regional clients. What they didn't understand was that failing logistics isn't a sudden collapse, it's a slow bleed. Every missed delivery, every jammed conveyor, every frustrated customer chips away at a company until one day there's nothing left to rescue. I saw that truth the moment I walked into their headquarters for the first strategy meeting. Mason sat at the head of the table, suit pressed, confidence overflowing, selling the illusion that he had everything under control. But the data on the screens behind him told a different story. Mountains of delays, weeks of backlog, complaints climbing like a staircase to nowhere. Leo, the CFO, kept rubbing his forehead like he was trying to push the numbers back into something less embarrassing. They needed answers, but none of them were ready to admit how deep the problem went. When they turned to me, I didn't sugarcoat anything. I walked out. I knew that whatever they were about to lose next would no longer involve me. The meeting they'd hoped would restore order had done the opposite. It had confirmed that walking away wasn't a risk. It was the only move left that made sense. I didn't step into something new immediately, and that choice mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Walking away without rushing gave me space to reset my instincts, to separate who I was from the role I'd been forced out of. When I finally made my decision, it wasn't driven by relief or anger, it was driven by alignment. I chose an environment where judgment wasn't treated like a threat and where relationships weren't reduced to line items. The difference was noticeable from the first week. Conversations were direct. Expectations were clear. When questions came up, they were asked openly instead of weaponized later. I was trusted to build instead of constantly asked to justify. That trust wasn't symbolic. It came with real authority, real responsibility, and the freedom to assemble a team that reflected the values I'd spent years practicing quietly. I reached out to people I'd worked alongside before, people whose talent had been constrained by the same rigid thinking that had eventually turned on me. Each one had a story. Each one had left not because they failed, but because the system punished competence that didn't look the way leadership expected it to. They didn't hesitate when I asked if they wanted to work together again. They'd been waiting for a reason to believe their experience mattered. What we built wasn't flashy, it was deliberate. We focused on listening before selling, on preparation before presentation, on respect before leverage. Clients noticed, they always do. Within months, momentum replaced uncertainty. New partnerships formed faster than I expected, not because we chased them, but because word travels quickly when people feel seen and taken seriously. Meanwhile, news filtered back from the place I'd left. It wasn't dramatic collapse. It was slower than that, quieter, the kind that happens when confidence erodes and trust doesn't recover. Accounts drifted, questions multiplied. Leadership changed tone in public while scrambling privately. The story circulated, not because anyone promoted it, but because it answered a question people had already been asking about what that company truly valued. Eventually, the man who had fired me disappeared from the organization. Official explanations were vague, the kind designed to preserve dignity that had already been spent. Others followed, the structure shifted, then ownership did. By the time I heard the company was being absorbed and restructured, it felt distant, almost irrelevant. That chapter had closed the moment I stopped trying to be understood by people invested in misunderstanding me. Sometimes people ask if it was worth it, if the loss, the stress, the uncertainty justified the outcome. Never answer that question the way they expect. It wasn't about winning or proving anyone wrong. It was about refusing to shrink myself to fit inside someone else's limitations. I learned that stability built on suppression is fragile, and loyalty demanded without respect is temporary. The most important thing I gained wasn't a title or compensation. It was clarity. Clarity about my value. Clarity about the environments I would no longer tolerate. Clarity about the kind of leader I chose to be once I had the chance to build something on my own terms. I tell the people who work with me now the same thing I had to learn the hard way. Document your work. Trust your instincts. Pay attention to how power reacts when it's challenged quietly. And when someone shows you exactly who they are, believe them the first time. The decision they made in that conference room was supposed to end my influence. Instead, it stripped away everything that had been holding it back. I learned this lesson in a conference room with half-closed blinds and a receipt pushed toward me like a verdict. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was procedural. A calendar invite, a printed email, a signature line tabbed. What stayed with me wasn't the firing. It was the calm I felt because I had prepared. I had emails approving the spend. I had notes from meetings. I had policies bookmarked. Strength like that looks ordinary until the room turns cold and you need proof more than passion. After I walked out, the calls started. Accusations softened into requests. The same leaders who dismissed my judgment suddenly wanted my help. I didn't need to raise my voice or threaten anything. The record spoke for me. Documentation turned emotion into fact, and fact into leverage. When the client called, I told the truth without decoration. The damage that followed came from words they chose after I was gone. What this took from me was sleep and certainty. What it gave me was clarity. I stopped mistaking approval for safety. I stopped assuming results protect you in cultures that worship control. Preparation did the protecting. If I were advising a friend, I'd say this. First, treat emails like contracts and contracts like shields. Second, recap meetings the same day while the memory is fresh. Third, keep your tone steady when others get sharp. Calm carries farther than anger. Fourth, leave a clean trail so you never have to argue your character. I won by being ready when the room turned cold. How to get started today. Save approvals and policies in one folder you can access fast. Send brief meeting recaps within 24 hours. Keep expense notes tied to outcomes, not feelings. Practice saying the truth once, clearly, without heat. Decide your line before someone crosses it. What detail did you document that later protected you?